just wanna be a superhero. With fearless thoughts, emotions swirl, I wanna be the man that saves the world.
Comic book and superhero fans are notorious for being relentlessly critical. And obviously I'm helping that image a lot. And with the critical acclaim the first Iron Man film garnered and the newfound fame it brought the character, taking him to an A-list status he had never seen amongst the most popular of Marvel's superheroes, it was a given that this film had to work extra hard to impress. Along with The Dark Knight in 2008, Iron Man helped legitimize superhero films in a new way, and made general audiences and critics alike take these movies on the whole more seriously. These two films were more character-driven. They were, overall, less formulaic than a lot of previous films of the subgenre, and there was a real emotional weight to them that audiences weren't used to seeing from these sorts of films. That's not to say that other superhero films hadn't accomplished similar things in the past, but to have two radically different superhero movies do that in the same summer was unheard of. So the pressure was on, and a lot of moviegoers felt Iron Man 2 didn't quite rise to the occasion. A lot of people are especially vocal about their opinion on this one. Most fans, at least in my experience, seem to really like it or really loathe it. And it's all a matter of balance. The people that really dislike Iron Man 2 feel it has too much of some things and not nearly enough of other things. Common complaints are too much comedy, not enough drama, too much build up to Avengers and not enough focus on the story at hand, and too much unnecessary talking and not enough action. For a long time I heard people dismiss this movie as a poor successor to the surprisingly fresh, entertaining, and sometimes thought-provoking Iron Man. And I just didn't understand the hate. In the theater, I didn't think it was as tight or exciting as the first film, but I thought most of that was just the novelty wearing off. When I saw Iron Man, I didn't expect to love Tony Stark and find him nearly as fascinating and charismatic as I did. When I went to Iron Man 2, charisma, charm, and lovable arrogance is exactly what I expected. But that was still there, it just wasn't new. I still got to see some fantastic action, especially on the racetrack with the suitcase suit, incredibly entertaining performances, not only from Robert Downey, but a villain like I'd never seen with Mickey Rourke's Ivan Vanko, or Whiplash as he's never called, and the hilarious and unexpected Tony Stark wannabe, Justin Hammer, played by Sam Rockwell, having as much fun as I've ever seen him have in a role. That scene where he sells Rhodey all his weapons and describes the missile he calls the ex-wife makes me laugh out loud every time. And I loved Don Cheadle, actually, over Terrence Howard as Rhodey. I thought he seemed a little more military and had a less soft-spoken, understated kind of presence on screen. I love the little acknowledgement to the actor change when he's introduced at the Senate hearing and he says to Tony, "It's me, I'm here, let's move on." But on this viewing, I picked up on a lot of story problems, especially after that initial fight with Whiplash, and I found the pacing to be uneven. I guess before, I just liked Downey in the role so much I wasn't paying attention to what was really going on in this movie. There's a standard villain. He wants revenge on Tony for something Tony's father did to his father. He tries to ruin Tony's reputation and kill him. Tony is self-destructing because he's dying. He finds a new appreciation for his father as he discovers an old secret that saves his life and allows him to beat the bad guy. He then beats the bad guy, fixes his reputation. The end. I think I always liked the ideas in this film and didn't look closely enough to realize the follow-up is much weaker than the initial setup. The themes are a natural progression from where we're left at the end of the first film. Legacy, what you leave behind, sins of the father, personal identity versus public perception, public service versus private enterprise, and the responsibility that comes with creating something intended for public good that could be used in the wrong hands as a weapon, which is a classic comic book motif, but it's usually used with mad scientists rather than with the superhero himself. There's even a Cold War parallel here when Tony calls himself a nuclear deterrent. The very existence of Iron Man has nearly created world peace. Terrorists are afraid of Iron Man, and it's keeping them from carrying out their awful plans. The two things that threaten this peace are someone else creating the thing Tony Stark created, and Tony Stark himself, one mortal human being not being up to the task of maintaining that peace single-handedly. These are all interesting ideas to explore, but there are two obstacles that prevent the movie from fully taking advantage of them. One is a lopsided comedic tone. Sometimes it feels to me like a big-budget superhero version of Whose Line Is It Anyway, rather than a natural progression of the narrative. and the other is a break in the film's internal logic, with a villain plot that becomes more nonsensical as it goes along. I think it is overall a riot of a movie. It's often wildly funny, and it's easy to get lost in its charm and ignore the problems. This is a movie I'll happily watch again. I'd love to just ignore those problems now, but sadly, I've got to put on my critical thinking hat once again. The thing I find most fascinating is that Iron Man 2 is all about the superhero identity, and Tony Stark revealed his to the public at the end of the first film. It takes the idea of the secret identity and turns it on its head. Tony is still keeping a huge secret, that he's dying from palladium poisoning. As Jarvis not so subtly points out, the substance that is keeping Tony alive is also killing him. Thanks, Jarvis. I think Tony knows that already. That's why he's been pricking himself and checking his toxicity level constantly. We got that too. Side note, there are a couple of irritatingly blatant moments of unnatural exposition in this film, and that's the worst one. Anyway, I suppose you could say that in a way, Tony is still keeping Iron Man a secret. Not that he is Iron Man, but that he's not Iron Man, or at least that he can't figure out how to save himself, and he won't be Iron Man for very long. At the public hearing, where Senator Stern insists Tony give up the Iron Man weapon to the government for the sake of public safety, Tony says that he is Iron Man and makes a joke about indentured servitude and prostitution. Oh, that name. Senator Stern here, Chief Stearns and Ninja Turtles. Okay, we get it. These guys are uptight, they don't like it when anybody's having any fun. I love how in this movie, naming a guy for his one defining character trait is acceptable, but we've got to avoid letting the villain ever be referred to as Whiplash. Even at the end of the film, Tony can't understand how Natasha Romanoff would recommend Iron Man for the Avengers Initiative and not him, because he and Iron Man are one and the same. He says you can't have one without the other, and he's in denial about this distinction, all the way up until he hears a list of his character flaws read back to him. Textbook narcissism? Agreed? In Tony's head, being Iron Man is the same as being Superman. You have to be perfect all the time. If you tell your whole country that you can protect it, that you have privatized world peace, that thanks to you the world is safer than it ever has been, and you can keep that going, you can't afford to show any weakness or people won't trust you and they'll panic. And so Tony is saying the same thing over and over again. I am Iron Man. I think because he's hiding behind that facade. In reality, he knows he's just a man. But he set himself up for incredible failure, because he can't come close to reaching that pedestal he's put himself on, and people are buying it. All the while, he's dying, and he can't tell anybody about it. He has created and branded the idea of this superhero, and it's that idea that is saving the day, not him, except that one time, last movie, and then at the end of this one. He's just a man, a brilliant man, who up till now thought he could fix anything, and he's finally discovered a problem he doesn't have the first clue about solving, saving his own life. He's keeping the secret that he is not the superhero everyone thinks he is, that he is not capable of keeping that peace he's promised everyone. And ultimately, as the toxicity level drops and he measures his own life as a percentage on a digital screen, he lets himself go completely to pieces. And so he feels he can't even tell Pepper Potts he's dying. Now, on the one hand, he's trying to continue playing hero and that he can do no wrong, so he doesn't want to reveal this to anyone. On the other hand, he gets to a point where he doesn't care who sees him self-destructing and ruining everything, especially his own legacy, when he makes a mockery of himself at his birthday party and he acts completely irresponsibly in the suit, first breaking beer bottles with repulsor rays and then blowing up his home in a fight with Rhodey in the War Machine armor. I suppose how he handles things makes sense with what he's going through emotionally, though I do resist his going so far as to having a knockdown, drag-out brawl with Rhodey. I have a hard time buying he'd go that far, but the movie is going out of its way to get him to that irrational of a place, so I'm trying to accept that it just strikes me as extreme even for drunk, broken, and dying Tony. Even going as far as he goes, I would have appreciated seeing Tony go to Pepper at some point midway through the film and confiding in her that he's dying. He's desperate and he doesn't know what to do. Keeping it from her for a while, okay, but at this point, he's got nothing to lose, and this is the woman that last movie he made reach into his chest and pull out a smoldering arc reactor, saying she was the only person he could count on. She was also instrumental in helping him stop Obadiah Stane. It seems like a step back for him to never confide in her the entire movie, and for her to find out on her own, overhearing him talk to Rhodey over communications toward the end. Although I do like the line, "I was going to make an omelet and tell you." So while the idea of Tony refusing to accept his own mortality because it conflicts with the identity he's built for himself is my favorite idea in the film, and the one that's most paid off by the end and in a pretty sophisticated and subtle way, his relationship with Pepper really doesn't work for me at all. I find it hard to believe that Pepper wouldn't start to suspect he's dying with as many clues as he's dropping. He suddenly decides to give away their entire modern art collection, he drives a race car in Monaco, he blows up his own house, and he makes her CEO of his company. All at about the same time. These seem like the choices of a man who doesn't have long to live, not just an eccentric billionaire, because he's never done anything nearly as out there as all of this. Sure, making her CEO isn't that crazy. She just thinks he's spread too thin being Iron Man and running a mega corporation, so that makes sense. What seems strange about it to me is that he calls her his successor. Bad word choice, Tony. Aren't you about the same age? Successor implies she gets everything when you die. If I was dying, I wouldn't use the word successor. I realize the film wants Tony to be at a rock-bottom place and feel like there's no one there for him. No hope until he discovers his father's secret and turns it into a father-son story where the son is redeemed while his own father is finally redeemed in his own eyes, and it makes sense that Pepper wants nothing to do with him after the fight with Rhodey. But I think their relationship is somewhat regressed from last film to make that work. The main thematic focus of the film is legacy, which Tony Stark spells out the first time we see him when he says, "It's about legacy." There are three major threats to both the Stark and the Iron Man legacy. I think it's important to separate them because even while Tony says they're one and the same, they're really not. One is a weapons manufacturer, though he doesn't do that anymore except for the Iron Man weapon, as Stern calls it, and the other is a superhero. Both, in their day, would say they're trying to protect people, but legacy is about public perception of a person, not about actual truth. Thus, it can be tarnished or rewritten. So Stark's legacy in the first film was in danger of being that of a man who created weapons for destruction, not weapons for protection, and his conscience about that led him to stop making weapons altogether and focus on being a superhero. So Tony himself is the first threat to his own legacy, as he emotionally falls apart and proves to the world that he can't handle the role he's forced for himself onto the world. The second threat is Ivan Vanko, the dark foil for his private intellectual persona, his equal in the arena of scientific invention, whose motive is revenge for what he feels is the destruction of Anton Vanko's legacy by Howard Stark, who had Anton deported back to Russia for trying to cash in on inventions Howard claims were his alone and stolen by Vanko. And the third threat is Justin Hammer, the dark foil of Tony's public persona, the man who has taken over the main stage of weapons manufacturing since Tony got out of the game. He has an inferiority complex. He's not nearly as good at making weapons or as suave and charming as Tony. He wants to be Tony, so he decides to ruin Tony's reputation to solidify that position, and he breaks Vanko out of prison to do it. So these are two shadows of Tony's personality, the brilliance and the arrogance, but none of the heart. They come together to become a force against Tony, and like Tony himself, they fall apart. Vanko double-crosses Hammer and uses him to get the tech he needs to get revenge on Tony. Tony has to constantly keep his ego in check or it consumes him, as we see that very nearly happens. That ego does destroy Hammer. He's so pleased with himself for thinking of breaking Vanko out of prison that he can't see past his own perceived brilliance to notice that Vanko obviously is not building tech for Hammer, but for himself. Look, he can't get his helmet in that. And Vanko is ultimately defeated by Tony because even while Tony's ego is ramped up by a factor of 5 as overcompensation for his fear of death, he's still Iron Man to help people, while Vanko is only Whiplash to hurt Tony Stark. One of my favorite things in the movie is the parallel of Vanko and Hammer's compound to Tony in the cave in the first film. Both are kidnapped and forced to make weapons for someone else. Both cleverly build something to facilitate their own escape. The difference is, Tony ultimately turns that creation into something to help everyone, and Whiplash is motivated solely by revenge in the first place. His creation is more about killing Tony even than it is to escape. Even if he's right, and Howard Stark really did screw over his father, he might be a somewhat sympathetic villain, but Tony still deserves to have and develop the technology over Vanko because his intentions are noble and not self-motivated. Oh, and I was surprised that Ivan does that death howl when his father dies. I guess some Russians have even more in common with Klingons than Star Trek led us to believe. By the end of the film, Tony's sanity is preserved in two ways. One, by relying on someone else, Rhodey, and not going it 100% alone. And secondly, by the Avengers Initiative, which suggests that there will soon be others to help protect the planet and Iron Man won't have to be the world's nuclear deterrent. Fittingly, the move that takes out Whiplash is the one they used against each other earlier in the film when they fought in Tony's house. When he was dying, he and Rhodey fought because he refused to accept the help he desperately needed. Here, he finally accepts that help, and the shockwave that represented his self-destruction now represents his rise back to heroism. Now that's not to say I like everything about this, of course. From a popcorn-eating entertainment perspective, that last fight is really anticlimactic. And after Tony acted so incredibly irresponsibly in the suit, it's a little hard for me to swallow that his reputation is completely intact at the end just because he beat up the one guy who happened to develop that technology. It doesn't seem like anybody's questioning if one person had it that fast, maybe somebody else is developing it, or maybe wondering if Tony's, I don't know, an alcoholic after the way he demolished his own property in the suit. The government just pins a medal on him, and it's back to business as usual. Maybe things would be better for Tony than they were in the middle of the film, sure, but he makes some pretty major mistakes, and I think he gets off a little too easy. And being told by Nick Fury that he's only going to be a consultant in the Avengers Initiative isn't quite enough for me. And again, I feel like Pepper is thrown under the bus, not being the person he has to rely on, putting her in this position of being angry with him the whole movie and screaming and yelling a lot. That great chemistry and comic timing they had in the first film is played up a lot here, but it doesn't work as well because Tony isn't really himself through a lot of the movie. So it's incredibly awkward. Sometimes funny awkward, and sometimes just awkward. Especially because, as I said earlier, I keep thinking she should be catching on to the fact that he's dying. So it's not just a mindless comedy action fest, and yet, even with a couple really intrusive and awkward lines of spoon-fed exposition, there are several facts this narrative needs to clear up that get lost in all the improvised comedy. In the commentary, Favreau talks a lot about scenes that were shortened and ideas that made it into the movie from improvisation that weren't in the script. There was a lot of that in the first film too, but somehow it managed to be a tighter and sharper story. This movie is so fixated on the comedy and funny visual gags, like the Iron Man Obama poster and that metal paperweight joke in Pepper's office, that it forgets to give us important information we need to believe characters' actions and motivations. And most of those have to do with Ivan Vanko, who I'm convinced is a character Mickey Rourke understands in a way that none of the rest of us do. Though not nearly as fleshed out as I'd like, I at least understand why he does what he does up until he's broken out of prison by Justin Hammer. He goes after Tony on the racetrack, but Vanko makes it clear in the prison after that scene that he had no intention of killing Tony, only to ruin his reputation. This is maybe the best exchange in the whole movie. If you could make God bleed, people would cease to believe in him. There will be blood in the water. The sharks will come. All I have to do is sit back and watch as the world consumes you. And that perfectly illustrates how high of a bar Tony has raised for himself and how impossible it is to reach. This is a great villain plot, because it's not about taking over the world or even about killing the superhero. It's about showing the world that the hero can't save them. But this is where things begin to unravel. Before Tony leaves, Vanko says, "Palladium in the chest. Horrible way to die." Having Vanko know this is a good idea for the narrative. It makes sense that he would try to ruin Tony's legacy just before he dies. But how does he know Tony is dying? Nobody else knows. Pepper doesn't know, and she has clues. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. You're coming up with all kinds of reasons he could know this. He's built an arc reactor, so he understands palladium, and he knows what it might do to a person if it's inside their body too long. Maybe his father, in trying to develop his own arc reactor, died of palladium poisoning. I kind of wish that was in there. So sure, the movie could very easily have made us buy that Vanko, because he's Tony's intellectual equal, has figured out Tony must be dying. But I want to know how he knows that. Tony knew all about palladium last movie, and he didn't seem to know it was going to inevitably poison him. It seems like he'd be an idiot for selling himself to the world as a god, as Vanko puts it, if he knew this was going to happen. And that was only 6 months prior. Then, having no idea this was going to happen, he gets broken out of jail and told to make suits like Iron Man so Hammer can upstage Tony. And in far less time than he would need to build all the drones, make his own special armor and the electric whips, and reprogram the War Machine armor, he sets this incredibly well thought out and involved plan to escape Hammer's compound and kill Tony Stark. Wait, why? What happened to sitting there watching the world consume Tony? The kicker is, his first plan worked, but as far as I can tell, just because this is a superhero movie and we need a climactic battle scene at the end, he tries to kill Tony, who he has every reason to think is still dying. That's right, he built all this tech to get revenge on a man he's already gotten his revenge on. who he thinks has mere days or weeks to live? Or does he magically know Tony has synthesized a new element based on his father's secret research, and that's why he switches gears and decides to kill him just for good measure? A reason could have easily been found to bring Vanko to this point believably, but instead, it turns a potentially interesting and somewhat atypical bad guy into that stereotypical madman who tries to blow up everything right out in the open for the sake of a big battle sequence, just like Obadiah Stane in the third act of the first film. The only difference is, Stane's plan makes sense a lot longer than Vanko's does. Now that The Avengers has been released, I actually like all the Avengers lead-up stuff quite a lot more than I did when I saw this in the theater. I was very much in that camp that thought this film was too much of a commercial for a movie that wasn't coming out for a couple years, and some of it is intrusive, but now I appreciate that it's used to service Tony's character arc, as Nick Fury and the Avengers Initiative humble him to a certain extent. That's not in the forefront, but it's there. I like that all the other movies being set up in what's now referred to as Phase 1 of the Marvel Cinematic Universe are given cameo references but aren't shoved in our faces. So Tony props up a table with Captain America's shield, Agent Coulson goes to contain Thor's hammer in New Mexico. I love that both of those are mentioned in the same scene, but we don't know yet why he's going to New Mexico until the scene at the end of the credits. And the climactic battle from Incredible Hulk is actually being played on a TV in the background at the same time as Nick Fury's last conversation with Tony. There is some talk about the Avengers throughout the film, but that's used as a plot point to explain why Nick Fury is even having Tony watched in the first place. And if he hadn't sent Natasha Romanoff to spy on Tony, Tony would have never figured out how to cure himself. And though I like Scarlett Johansson in the role, I think there was a real missed opportunity with Natasha Romanoff. A lot of people cried foul that this universe's Black Widow doesn't have a Russian accent. I don't mind that it doesn't stick with source material completely, but the only reason seems to be that Johansson couldn't or didn't want to fake an accent the whole movie. The trouble is she's supposed to be Russian, or at least we're sure of that by Avengers, in a movie with a Russian villain, so she feels a little shoehorned in the way the movie plays now, just an introduction to this character who's going to be a big deal when she's in the Avengers. But she would have felt much more necessary if something was done with the fact that she and the bad guy are both from the same country. And I think there's a really easy way to work around the Russian accent. She's working undercover as Pepper's new assistant, Natalie Rushman. Why not have the character fake an English accent most of the movie and only do a Russian accent when she blows her own cover at the end and puts on that incredibly conspicuous looking jumpsuit? All in all, despite being uneven, it's a really entertaining movie, and it does something unusual with that classic trope of the superhero's secret identity. But few of its ideas are explored far enough, and the main villain's plot makes perfect sense to begin with, and then it falls apart as the movie struggles to find a reason to keep chugging along past Tony's creation of that new element. Who knew the secret to his survival was a triangle? Oh, and what was that bird thing all about? I'm going to give Iron Man 2 a 2.5 out of 4. And join me next time when we go back to some animation finally and tackle Superman Batman Public Enemies. Stay tuned.